I guess so, yeah. So she just gave the 2-minute warning to the web, so it'll... Okay. Okay, welcome everybody. Thank you for coming. Good afternoon. My name is Gib Clark. I am a program associate here at the Woodrow Wilson Center's Global Health Initiative, and I'd like to welcome you to today's discussion of strengthening relationships to defeat hidden hunger in recognition of today being World Food Day. Before we get started, I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Center and the Global Health Initiative. The Wilson Center was founded in 1968 by an act of Congress to be the living memorial to Woodrow Wilson. As Woodrow Wilson was our only president to have earned a PhD, the Center attempts to bring the worlds of policy and the world of ideas together. The Global Health Initiative was started up almost 2 years ago now in response to the fact that here at the Center we have about 20 programs, and all of them in one way or another were involved in health work. So the Global Health Initiative was founded to bring those fields together and also to look at 4 main topics: health's impact on development, the role of international and national institutions in global health policy, infectious diseases, and emerging health technologies. This is our second event in recognition of Food Day, of World Food Day. We had one last year, along with the World Food Program, Africa, and IFPRI, and we were looking at food security and its impact on international development and HIV. We're lucky to have 2 experts here today with us to talk about the complexities of dealing with government and private sector cooperation in increasing access to fortified foods and effectively addressing the problem of hidden hunger in the developing world. You have much more detailed information on the 2 speakers, but I will provide just brief introductions here. Tamara Bekefi, excuse me, I told you I'd mess it up. Tamara Bekefi is an independent consultant and an expert on corporate responsibility, corporate, political, and social risk, and sustainable private sector development. She was formerly a research fellow and manager of Harvard's Business and International Development Research Program at the Kennedy School of Government. Michael Jarvis is a corporate responsibility specialist with the Business Competitiveness and Development Program at the World Bank Institute. He is a founding editor of the WBI's Business and Development discussion papers, and he has worked in the past on fair labor issues in the U.S. and on promoting transparency in the arms trade. One final note before we get started. You'll see the camera in the back there. We are webcasting today's event. What this means is that when we get to the question and answer period, please wait for a microphone to come around and tell us who you are so people watching online can know. Okay, Tamara?
Great, thanks so much for having us. I think I have to move this a little closer. I will be going over some of the more overview aspects of micronutrient deficiency, and then Michael will dig a little bit deeper, talking about some of the public-private partnerships that he has been involved with through the World Bank Institute. So just to begin, on World Food Day, we often think of food issues as malnutrition and only malnutrition. But micronutrient deficiency really is one of the major issues facing our time and is a hidden epidemic. It's a lack of proper vitamins and minerals in diet and has been called the most widespread and devastating nutritional deficiency on Earth. So it's quite a serious matter that doesn't get a lot of attention, and that's why we're very glad that you're hosting us so we can discuss that a little bit more today. On the individual level in developing countries, micronutrient deficiency, as I'm sure a lot of you know, have a very serious impact. The lack of micronutrients can cause blindness, low birth weight and stunted growth, and compromise life expectancy. Between 40 and 60% of infants have impaired cognitive development because of micronutrient deficiency, and the world's under 5s, which are children under 5 years old, 40% of them have impaired immunity because of lack of micronutrients. There's an estimated 200,000 births annually that children are born with birth defects because of micronutrient deficiency, either prenatally, that their mothers do not get micronutrients from their own time of birth, or during their pregnancies with these children. Deaths due to micronutrient deficiency before and during childbirth are estimated at 60,000 a year, and the intellectual capacity of people globally is diminished by 10 to 15%. So it's a pretty significant impact, which goes hidden for the most part. The impact on economic growth and development is also significant in developing countries. It's been estimated that the global cost burden of micronutrient deficiency is somewhere in the neighborhood of $180 billion annually. Adult work performance that's lost annually is estimated at $6 billion due to micronutrient deficiency in developing countries. There was an Asian Development Bank study done on micronutrient deficiency, and the 10-year productivity loss only from iron deficiency was hovering at $25 billion annually. And the GDP lost in developing countries annually is somewhere in the 2 to 3% range. And globally, 3 billion people annually fail to achieve their full potential as students, parents, workers, and citizens because of lack of micronutrients in their diet. So both on the micro and the macro level, this is a really serious issue that we just don't see because there's no emaciation, and it's just something that kind of has gone under the radar screen. So as always, the question is there an affordable solution? And the answer is yes. The Copenhagen Consensus, which was convened a few years ago, brought together 10 leading economists, 3 of whom were Nobel Prize winners, asking the question, what is the best way of advancing global welfare, particularly in developing countries, given an extra $50 billion to spend? So the first answer was controlling HIV, and the second answer was providing micronutrients in diet. And there were 6 others, but as you can see, malnutrition and addressing it through micronutrient deficiency came in at number 2. So there are very affordable solutions, and that's not the issue. Investing in micronutrient deficiency helps to achieve the UN Millennium Development Goals. There are 5 of those, as I'm sure many of you know better than I do. The first one, eradicating extreme poverty and hunger, clearly. Providing micronutrients that erode human capital and impact human cognition can address the poverty issue and the hunger issue. Universal primary education. If children can't learn because of stunted development and inability to develop cognitively, then it's very hard to achieve universal primary education. Women are impacted on balance more than men because of the childbearing issue and loss of iron in childbearing, in the blood that's lost when giving birth, and providing nutrients to children, to their unborn children when they're pregnant. So this could also address gender equality issues. Reducing child mortality, I just gave the statistics on the child mortality issue directly related to micronutrient deficiency. Improving maternal health, again, I went over those statistics. And the statistics are kind of mind-boggling when you look at them and when you hear them, but it just points to the fact that this really is a very, very serious issue. In combating HIV, malaria, and other diseases which are really on our radar screen, addressing micronutrient deficiency and providing more micronutrients helps to combat some of those diseases. HIV transmission has been seen to increase with lack of micronutrients. Lack of micronutrients has compromised the uptake of antiretroviral therapies and hastens the onset of full-blown AIDS and premature death. And it also compromises immune systems, so makes people more prone to tuberculosis infection, malarial infection, et cetera, et cetera. So as I just discussed, it's not an issue of cost, but it is an issue that requires a multi-sector solution. And the reason for that is because each sector provides expertise and resources that is unique to that sector. The private sector are the ones who produce and distribute food. The government is not in the business of growing or producing food for us. Farmers are and companies are. So that's the expertise that they lend has to do with the production and distribution of food. Government, in charge of policy and enforcement of policy, is where they can lend a hand. And civil society can contribute through implementation and access to markets. Oftentimes, the people who need micronutrients the most are not the ones who have food available to them directly through open markets, and it's the civil society players who can contribute to getting the nutrients to those people. So the question often is, why is the private sector engaged? And Michael will be going over this more, but in general, it's both from the supply and the demand side. The private sector is dependent on a labor force, and in order to get workers who are contributing their full capacity, they need to be cognitively developed, clearly. We all need to be contributing in that way, and particularly businesses that are dependent on fine motor skills and not the labor efficient ones, but the ones that are more in the cognitive side of things, are dependent on people who have been able to develop adequately in childhood through to adulthood. And on the demand side, low earning potential because of inability to work at full capacity means that people cannot spend their money to buy goods, so it creates underperforming markets. So it's both the demand and the supply side that impels business to get engaged. And how is the private sector getting engaged? And once again, Michael will be going over this in detail with some examples, but generally they're growing foods and they're fortifying some of those foods. They're feeding people. They're using their marketing departments to engage in cause-related marketing around micronutrient deficiency and fortification issues. They're creating innovative fortified foods or supplements that can be added to foods for particular markets where there's certain micronutrients that are deficient. And they're distributing the foods and information through their supply chains. So that's some of the ways that the private sector is getting engaged in this. And if we can look at the ways that micronutrient deficiency can be addressed, the solutions to it, they're fivefold. Fortification is one of the more obvious means of addressing micronutrient deficiency. So that's just adding key vitamins and minerals to products. There's supplementation, adding on top of existing products some supplements. There's education, which is really critical. Often people have access to enough food, but it's not the right balance of foods, and so they're lacking in key micronutrients, although families are happy and well-fed and feeling full. They're lacking in very critical micronutrients. There's feeding, which is engaging schools and other feeding programs to provide, particularly to youth, micronutrients through feeding programs, and then there are general public health measures that can be undertaken. And these things can be done either individually by governments, companies, and the public sector, or in tandem. So quickly, I'll just talk about some of the challenges of food fortification, because up till now it seems pretty easy. It's not expensive, there are simple solutions, but it's really a pretty complicated situation. The costs can be prohibitive, particularly because the private sector, when it's one company that is providing micronutrients through its food and fortifying while its competition is not, if they're taking on the burden of that cost, it can become uncompetitive for them, and so they lose out and they drop out of the market. So addressing issues of costs and standards is very, very important. Political will in general in many countries that are facing a myriad of health issues can be a huge challenge. You know, if you're in a country and you're the Minister of Health or the Minister of Education and you're looking at HIV and tuberculosis and malaria staring you in the face, and then someone comes along and says, well, micronutrients, and you say, I don't see this, I don't see why this is a problem, and we have a lot of other big issues in front of us on the table. So that's another issue, is the political will and education of people in government to see how this impacts on a much wider swath of human health than just this very, very particular micronutrient deficiency. there's a lack of understanding, again, of the wide impact that this has on both health and development and economic development. So making the tie between human health and this kind of hidden issue and economic development is really important. Delivery systems are hard to implement and put in place. Once again, a lot of the people who need these micronutrients are at the bottom of the pyramid and don't have access to markets and don't have access to the foods that could provide these things to them. For the public and the private sector, finding suitable partners, which is something Michael will be talking about, to engage in this in the short, medium, and long term can be a challenge. National issues like tariffs, duties, and food laws can be very challenging. Some countries, on principle, do not believe in fortification or additives to their foods, and so the way that in the United States our sodium and flour is fortified to guard against iron deficiency, and the flour has additives to guard against spina bifida and other spinal cord issues in developing fetuses. Some countries really don't believe in adding micronutrients to their food supplies, and so this can really impact developing countries who are getting those products. So addressing some of those issues, creating an enabling environment, like many issues in developing countries, that can be a challenge. And there are legal barriers and public policy constraints that have hindered implementation of fortification and other measures to address micronutrient deficiency. But on the positive side, there are public-private partnerships that are engaging in this issue and have for a good number of years now. And while it's not the only answer, it's potentially one of the answers to this global dilemma. And while it's an answer, it's not easy, again, to create, grow, or manage these public-private partnerships because of the issues that face different sectors in different ways, including speed, achievements, goal setting, communication issues, and Michael will be going over some of that in his presentation. So quickly, we're going to be discussing later on the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, which was founded in 2005, and Michael will give more details, I think, on this, to address micronutrient challenges worldwide. They're funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation in part, and they have a roster of experts on board, including people in countries, targeted countries, to work on this, and they engage collaboratively to build partnerships with business, civil society, and government organizations to address micronutrient deficiency. So they started, I think I said 2005, but I meant 2002. In 2005, they launched something called BAF, the Business Alliance on Food Fortification, to identify new financial mechanisms and new business models to address micronutrient deficiency in developing countries, to expand scientific knowledge about the issue and expertise in fortification in particular, and to catalyze joint action between companies, governments, and civil society to address micronutrient deficiency. And they've been rolling out programs since 2005, and Michael will be talking about a couple of those, and some of the challenges and also successes that they have faced and accomplished in the last couple of years. So I've listed a couple of useful resources. Michael brought one of our papers that's available on the back table with lunch, so that's an incentive. There are cookies back there also. So if you want to grab that. It has a longer list of resources on the back if you're interested in finding out more about it, and there are also websites that address a lot of these issues, and you can find out more about that. So that's what I'm here to talk about, and now Michael, I think, is going to talk about more detailed issues having to do with particular public-private partnerships and also what the World Bank Institute is doing.
Sure.
Okay, thank you very much. While we switch over the presentations, let me just say really quickly, I think this report is actually outside, and also the websites and everything else, the PowerPoints, will be up online shortly, along with the archived webcast. So we can send out a note in a few days when that is all ready.
All right, I think we're safely switched over presentations. Good afternoon. Thanks again for the invitation to be here. And it's good to see those in the room and hopefully be heard by those out there virtually. So, as Tamara said, I will run through in a little more detail 3 specific cases that the World Bank Institute's been involved with and the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition GAIN, and try and draw out a few of the challenges they've been facing, what's working, what isn't, and what maybe a few common success factors are at the end before we open up for discussion. So let me take you through, I have a little introduction just to, in case people don't know what the World Bank Institute is. We are the capacity building arm of the World Bank Group. There's the lending bank, and then there's effectively the knowledge bank. WBI, the Institute, does not do any lending, but we do provide a lot of technical assistance, training, and learning events for our clients in developing countries. And it's under that we have this program around the role of business in development, looking at corporate responsibility, looking at increasing investment in emerging markets, and looking at business roles, in particular for the Millennium Development Goals. So these are our 3 core areas. Corporate responsibility, business, and the MDGs, as I mentioned, and this latest component, which is private sector governance and anti-corruption, which we're finding that you can't escape the corruption issue when you're looking at many of these issues. So we've realized that we want to be proactive in encouraging the private sector to take steps, be it through codes of conduct, be it through advocacy of government for greater transparency. And even on the nutrition issue, this comes up. Even in some of the cases I highlight, corruption is one of those factors that is undermining the success of many of these initiatives, be they government-run, private sector-run, or even with civil society. It's still a factor. So this slide is to give you a little sense from a recent report done by my colleagues over at the International Finance Corporation, the private sector arm of the World Bank, and the World Resources Institute. They looked at the next 4 billion, this idea at the bottom of the pyramid, all these consumers out there in developing world, and how do companies tap into them, both as consumers and producers. What's interesting, I think, is if you look at this arranged by sector, and the food sector is dominant. This is where people, poor people spend their money on food. It makes sense, but it also shows that we can't afford to neglect this sector, and also there's an opportunity here if we can engage companies, both local producers and international, around this issue of vitamin and mineral deficiencies. And with their support, we actually have a chance to make a significant difference. And this sort of feeds into the links between the health community, focusing on this nutrition objective, and the private sector, who are looking at expanding markets, improved corporate responsibility, partnerships. And what GAIN and WBI are trying to do is bring those 2 trends together, combine expertise, complementary expertise, look for ways in which we can facilitate private sector action and government action and joint action around these issues, and including bringing in the right academic, civil society partners where needed. So we hope that we, together through this GAIN Business Alliance, as it's now simplified on our name of the alliance, which has over 200 companies now participating around the world. And it's through this framework that we're trying to make some difference through individual projects, through shared learning, and then working with a broader community of business actors and government actors to raise the profile of this issue. So more specifically, together with GAIN, we're looking at developing learning tools and programs for the members of the Business Alliance, helping them raise the issue within their firms, convince their employees, convince their customers, and telling them how to do it. Then we're looking at development of case studies, which some of those I will be drawing on today, showcasing best practices. And then looking at how we support this role of advocacy and raising awareness. And here I'd like to say that it's not just an issue for food companies. Tamara touched on this, but we've had events here where we've had advertising companies, we've had media companies, we've had logistics, distribution companies. So you don't have to be just involved in the production or sale of food, and the retailers are also an important aspect here. I think there's a role for the business community as a whole here, particularly around this advocacy agenda, where we've found great support from the advertising and media sectors. So bringing us back to the problem, this slide shows the areas of the world that have, the greatest extent of micronutrient deficiency, where is most at risk. I mean, the sad factor is that it covers a huge proportion of the globe, and the areas in black are those where it's not only vitamin iron and iron deficient, but also iodine deficient. And what we're trying to do together with GAIN is look at those areas where we can have most impact. And often it tends to be the bigger countries. China and India cover a large proportion of those who are most affected. The most populous nations, again, Nigeria. And this is something where we're looking at examples and building capacity within those countries first. But that's not to say we're neglecting the other countries. We do have programs. We have regional versions of the Business Alliance for Africa. We're going to set one up for Latin America where we're bringing in and sharing experiences throughout the regions. But in terms of having a more immediate impact, there has been a case made and accepted that we will target those countries where we can reach the most people and have the most impact in the near future. So the three cases I'm going to briefly talk about. The first one is a project that's been set up by Tetra Pak and the Nigerian government. Tetra Pak in 2000 set up a Food for Development office. They're primarily a packaging company. Going back to my point about it's not just food companies. But they developed a technology for packaging, particularly beverages, that they saw a potential benefit in the development community, because this can be, when they're in this packaging, you can store it in high heat. It doesn't matter what the local conditions are, but pretty much the integrity of the product will remain the same. And that means that the health benefits of the product will remain the same as well. So they, together with partners, developed a drink called Nutrisip, which was first used in South Africa, which contains a combination of vitamins and minerals, sort of to reflect the daily needs of children. And they've been partnering in Nigeria to develop the Nasarawa school feeding program, which has already reached over 400,000 children. And the idea is to scale that up, and potentially you could reach as many as 25 million children all over Nigeria. And there's a real need. The top bullet there talks about Nigeria being among the top 20 countries in which 40% of those aged under 5 are chronically malnourished. So we know there's a problem, and this is one example we've been looking at where the private sector has partnered with government to try and address it. But also they brought in other partners. GAIN has been helping look at monitoring the impact of these, so looking at the health benefits, doing clinical trials and studies, together with Helen Keller International and Cornell University. We've also been looking at trying to capture what the business case is. Why is Tetra Pak doing this? Why are their suppliers involved? So just to give a quick overview, it was launched back in 2004, and by fall of 2005, already 74,000 children were receiving Nutrisip. In the previous slide, you saw that's already expanded over tenfold. But what was vital about getting this off the ground was the support of the president, then president of Nigeria, and the governor of the state. It's with that political leadership that they were able to help mobilize the support of the officials within the state and get things going. And in terms of buying the product, it's 100% financed by federal and state funds. But Tetra Pak are providing all-important technical support and helping manage the development of the project. And they've also brought in Soleil of DuPont, who helped adapt some of the drink qualities to be able to fit, make sure that it has the full health benefits within the packaging. So this is just to show you what it's all about. Here's a picture of the children receiving the Nutrisip drink in the cartons that they get daily. Now, it's not to say that it wasn't without problems. There were an awful lot of problems in this project, and there still are in scaling it up. One of the key ones was that initially they wanted to get the project going as soon as possible and start delivering the product, but there was no local production. So initially they were importing the product from South Africa, where Tetra Pak already had a production chain going. But it was recognized that Nigeria didn't have enough of a dairy industry to support production of Nutrisip locally, because it's a milk-based drink. So Tetra Pak and Soleil actually went back and helped work with local experts to develop a product that will be made from cassava, which is locally grown and is a local adapted production line. So they've that was one of the first stages, is how to get that production line going, get the technology right, make sure that the drink, in effect, you have to reinvent a new drink using some of the technology that they could transfer from Nutricet. And it's also part of this sort of agriculture to consumer model that Tetra Pak were emphasizing and continue to do, where they look at everything from product development through to its recycling of the packaging when it's done. And what are the role of producers, the consumers within that? And here's one graphic that helps show that. They're looking at the food production, the food processing, the distribution and retail, and the consumers. And any company would do this for any product, but here they're looking also at having a social benefit. So for all of these, they're also looking at, how do we create jobs, how do we provide training, how do we ensure that, we can have social marketing to create the market for this product, and then how do we ensure that the children who are receiving the product are actually getting the health benefits that we want them to have, so that we know it's worth scaling up and continuing. So a lot of thought has gone into this, but throughout they encountered a lot of difficulties just from the basic business environment. It's not an easy place to do business. Everything as basic as no electricity. So they would go out to the production site and suddenly for days there would be no electricity. So how do you deal with problems such as that? Trying to maintain momentum, particularly when the product was first being introduced from South Africa, it might be held up in customs for days or weeks, and you would have to negotiate to get the product out so it could reach the schools. Burden on the company to convince people that this was having an impact and that it was working, because the company itself, Tetra Pak, had invested a lot in this, both in terms of its resources, but also in terms of its reputation. And so they found themselves increasingly going beyond just a technical assistance role, but actually a management role to make sure the project kept going and encourage and work with the officials on a day-to-day basis. It was very time-consuming. And they also found that if you address the vitamin and mineral deficiencies, that's wonderful. You're having a good story, but that's not enough. They then were looking and seeing that these same children needed clean water. They needed school books. They needed improved school curricula. So the more they were involved, the more they realized that this was only one part of the solution. But that said, they have scaled up the program. It will continue to scale up. And the fact that they managed to adapt the production to this locally sourced product, I think, will enable it to prosper going forward and perhaps reduce the costs and time needed to be involved. But the need for political will is always there, and political changes in Nigeria meant that every time there's a new leader, they have to renegotiate why this project needs to be there, why it's important, and why officials should be supporting it. A very different case is one from Procter & Gamble, where this is much more a company-driven. They have partnerships in each of the product launches, but this has been an example really of where a company, through its own research and development, has come up and found that it has something to offer in terms of addressing vitamin and mineral deficiencies, and have then explored how to make use of that. It's a company that's had a lot of history of innovation, has a very strong research and development function, and they found that they could develop something called lock-unlock fortification system. Because of a lot of products claim that they're supplying vitamins, vitamin A, for example, but in practice, the health benefits may not be as high as people would think, because the product isn't actually, when it's ingested, doesn't actually release the vitamins to the person's system so that they can get the health benefits. So they created this thing called lock-unlock, having examined what many natural products actually did, how they work. They discovered that you need to basically lock in the vitamins and minerals until they're ingested, and then they're released in the system. That's when they're unlocked, and then the person actually gets the benefits. So the bioavailability of this product is ensured. Because otherwise, it doesn't matter how many, liters of a fortified drink or pounds of a fortified food someone was eating. If the benefits weren't actually getting into their system, then you weren't achieving anything. And in this process, they found that in specific countries where they've been launching products, they've needed local partners to make this work, be it through social marketing of the product, be it through research and then testing to make sure the clinical trials are working, and government agencies to help them see that there's a need. So this slide shows a little bit of a list of where they've been trying to use this technology. And And it first began back in Mexico, where they had a drink called Choco Milk, fortified with iron, vitamin C, and 8 other micronutrients, that actually became very successful in the local market. And that's where they decided that there was potential to invest more within this. And soon after that, within the Philippines, they also developed Star Margarine, which is vitamin A fortified, and also was successful in the market. So they decided to build on this and then really expand and develop the lock-unlock system, so that they could produce a new drink that they would think would be worked and made available on a global scale. And they developed something called Nutrilite that they piloted in the Philippines. And they made the effort to create a local production chain. They had strong clinical results and partners. But the trouble was there was political instability within the country, and then Procter & Gamble themselves decided to shift away from sort of country initiatives to only global brands. And so they actually, this wasn't yet a global brand, so this one was actually stopped as a result before it could get going. A similar problem in Venezuela. The drink was remarketed as Nutristar. Again, strong social marketing. They managed to get 90% market recognition within 3 months and build up a 15% market share within a year, which is actually pretty successful in business terms. But again, Venezuela then experienced political instability, and P&G made the decision to divest from the country. So here's an example where a company's made the technological investment and found ways to make this work, but are having trouble in finding and building markets because they want to do it on a profitable basis, a sustainable model where it's affordable for poor consumers, but also self-sustaining in terms of meeting production costs. They tried again in Nicaragua, where they licensed to a local producer. Again, they had USAID provide costs to help meet social marketing needs. And again, they quickly created a market segment. But again, USAID pulled out this time in terms of their funding. They shifted from actually funding nutrition projects to HIV/AIDS projects. So suddenly the social marketing component was gone, and the product suffered as a result, and the local producer actually halted production. And finally, there's one that's starting up in China, which is called Yin Yangxing, and is actually a fortified rice. And this time they're again looking at a commercial model, how to build up a market, not just provide it for school feeding programs, for example. And this is underway right now with some pilot tests in some cities in China. But again, you need a lot of the education component to tell people why they should be picking this over any other product. So again, just some of these challenges I've already referenced, but the complexity of the science involved here can't be underestimated. You need a firm with the capacity to be able to deal with those. You need leadership within the firm. This is something that was driven by the researchers, but didn't necessarily have the full buy-in from the management and the sales teams. So how do you make sure you get the right combination of skills and an impetus across the firm? Frequently, they would start making progress, and then they would have to stop because of political and business environment effects. These could be political instability, it could be shifts in the company's strategy, or often it's even this issue of a level playing field. Competitors would claim that P&G's suggestions about the health benefits were false. They would have to go into court, defend them. Often they would win those battles. In fact, I don't know of a case where they didn't, but the time involved and the risks are already done in terms of their reputation. And this links into that whole point about needing local production and also a way to ensure effective market entry into the local within local competition. So none of these things are easy, and the company doesn't want to give up on this technology. They're still looking to license it around the world because they see the health benefits of it. And they also believe that it can be a sustainable business model if in the right conditions. But you need the right partners, you need the right science, and you need effectively to hit that sweet spot of the right business environment where you can prove that it works. And finally, we're going to look at an example of China's soy sauce fortification, where this is one where perhaps it's more led by government, and then they brought in the private sector. Going back to China's 2002 census, over 20% of women of childbearing age suffered from iron deficiency anemia, and the rate was higher than that within rural areas of the country. Based on this, the government recognized that it was a growing problem, and they appointed the China Center for Disease Control, not only to look at well, actually not only to look at control of disease, but to look at prevention of disease. And therefore, they were given responsibility to take up the micronutrient deficiency agenda. And this is where you need to look at something, a product that's culturally appropriate and also scientifically appropriate to deliver the results you want. And in the end, they chose soy sauce because 80% of the country consume soy sauce, and at a daily rate where if you get that fortified, they will get the health benefits. And it was much cheaper than the alternatives, such as provision of fresh meat or iron tablets in terms of addressing iron deficiency anemia. So they came up with this proposal and partnership development effectively called Two Wheels Turning Together, where they combine the expertise of the Center for Disease Control with the private sector manufacturers of soy sauce. And looking particularly at one case we're writing up from Shenji Brew Company, which is based in Hebei province, and one of the largest soy sauce producers in the country. And they were approached by the Center for Disease Control. They considered it, and they agreed to take part, basically recognizing there were public health benefits, but also benefits for them in terms of building up their markets, particularly in rural areas, and sort of segmenting a market built around fortified soy sauce, where they would be one of the leaders. And at the beginning, there was nothing out there. So particularly for Hebei province, where Shenji took the lead, it was pretty much impossible to get iron fortified soy sauce back in 2001. But by 2007, it's now available in over 90% of supermarkets. How did they do this? Partly a reflection of extensive marketing by the Center for Disease Control, supported by a GAIN grant, by the media, and by Shenji themselves. They invested several $1 million in their own marketing, targeting consumers, but also retailers, persuading them why they should stock this product, offering incentives, for example, for the return of empty bottles of soy sauce of the fortified brand, they would get a certain percentage back on the return of those. And the CDC did everything from printing aprons to putting posters on the walls to pamphlets to TV ads. I mean, they're talking millions and millions of products that they launched within these target regions to raise awareness. And it had some effect. Shenji's fortified sauce sales doubled each year. They're now consumed by almost 8.5 million people. In fact, over that now. That was between October 2005 and October 2006. Their sales are growing over 25%, and they anticipate making a profit on their fortified production this year. And they're expanding capacity within the company to increase that to 100,000 tons of production. This graphic is an example of one of their ads that the company developed, not the government. And I can actually tell you somewhere what it says. The upper caption is, when you have iron, you have strength. And the lower caption is, when you eat soy sauce, be sure to use the iron kind. And so through examples such as this, they've helped raise awareness and actually find consumers. It says here that in the first 2 years, they reached 58.6 million residents, around 300 million in Hebei province. And they're now up to expanding that with the goal of reaching 130 million of those who are, well, they estimate that there are 130 million people at risk, and they hope to reach 360 million people overall through a scaling up of this campaign nationally. So you actually reach more than you also need to reach family members who can educate those who might be at risk and so on. And they're also looking at expanding up this in innovative ways. GAIN has helped to negotiate an agreement with Carrefour, a European retailer who's now expanding operations in China, to be able to provide shelf space at no charge for those producers, local producers that are offering fortified soy sauce. But this wasn't an easy process, and at various points, Shenji company, almost thought twice of what they were doing. They found that building up the local market wasn't always easy. Part of that is that consumer trust and loyalty, particularly around soy sauce, is quite extreme. People build up a loyalty to a certain brand, so to be able to convince them to change was not easy. And they didn't trust necessarily the company's publicity about the health benefits. Many of the surveys found that the government played a crucial role. It was their campaigning that actually helped turn public opinion, reinforced by the companies, but you needed that independent verification. There are also high costs of setting up a new production line. They haven't yet made a profit. They should do this year on this, but you need a certain leadership that buys into this whole social benefit as well as the commercial benefit in order to allow a company to invest that amount of money and take that risk without necessarily a guaranteed return. And you don't really know how big this market is. It's enormous on paper, but in reality, when you go out there and start marketing, how easy is it? Many of the rural consumers would bring a bag and take a very small sample of a huge vat of soy sauce that was sort of distributed within the villages. So how do you change a distribution chain like that? How do you make sure that people can still buy small samples, but make sure that it's of a high-quality brand and of a fortified brand, as opposed to the previously largely low-quality product that was available to them? And you need to constantly negotiate the commitment between the partners to make this work. Even within the government, the Centre for Disease Control were given responsibility for this issue, but they still had to work with all their local branches and with the Ministry of Health and with other government parties to get them on board to make it work and be effective. They also had to constantly negotiate with the firms they were dealing with, making sure they could certify the production, that they were up to standard, that the health benefits were going to be ensured for their own risks and also to protect the consumers they were looking to reach. So overall, a few points that sort of seem common to all of these cases. One is the commitment, both from the firm and the partners, and the need for the right combination of partners with the right sets of expertise. The need for local capacity to really ensure that you can build understanding and build a partnership that will work effectively. And often that isn't necessarily there on the ground initially, and you need technical assistance to help build it. Local production and culturally aligned products. You need to find the product that will work. In the case of Nigeria, importing the product from South Africa, there was suspicion of what this was. It was a foreign product. It wasn't based on local ingredients. You need to find a way to address those and shift to local production, which is cheaper and more effective. And you need that stable operating environment. And finally, you need the results to, A, encourage people to keep going, but also show that the health benefits are there and having an impact on the ground. Without that, people will soon lose momentum, lose interest, and you'll find it harder to keep maintaining the investment. And this leads to my very last point of promise, which is how do we scale these up? All these initiatives are great, and they're important, but in terms of the impact they're having, given the size of the problem that Tamara outlined, there's a lot of work still to be done. We've got to scale up and have hundreds and thousands of these companies and partnerships working if we're to reach the number of people we need to. In some environments, it might be easier than others. In China, they iodized salt, and they were able to set up an army of 20,000 salt inspectors who literally went around to every salt production facility in the country, making sure that the standards were met. But you can't do that in every country. So how do we reach the scale we need to? And there's a quote from one of the Procter & Gamble managers we talked to, saying that we've learned a lot, we've done a lot, and the technology is still not out there, even though they've done a lot of research. But really, the technology is not the issue. The process is not the issue, the quality, nor the manufacturing. It's the willingness to get it done that is the issue. This was a problem identified 30 years ago, and I don't know why these people are still suffering. There are solutions, but why it hasn't happened is still the big question. And I think this links back to the sort of overall health agenda issue, and this has been slightly an orphaned problem. No one claims that it's their responsibility overall. So how we bring in changes in the public sector with greater awareness and actions from the private sector is key in order to be able to take this to scale and actually address the problem and have the benefits that we need to. So on that point, I will end, and thank you very much for being so attentive.
Okay, thank you very much for two great presentations. Please let me know if there are any questions. Again, when you get the microphone, just let us know who you are.
My question's directed to Mr. Jarvis. Is this on?
Yeah.
About distribution of food across income levels. In a city like D.C., there are programs where people who have nutritious food in good supply, perhaps by late afternoon, give the food to a local free dinner program or something like that. Are distribution systems in effect in other countries throughout the world to diminish the unevenness of food availability to people of different incomes?
Not at the sophisticated level it is in the U.S. and many, particularly in more industrialized countries. In fact, that's part of the problem, is the inequality levels within many of the target countries are huge. It's not that there isn't food, it's about getting it to the people who need it most, and getting the right kind of food to them. And there isn't, and the rise of the obesity problem in many of these same countries, now it's not just a problem of the US and Europe, is a reflection of that, some people are getting too much food, and not the right nutrition balance. So this distribution level and access is a key problem, and I think it's one that the private sector can play some part of the role in, but it also needs the creation of an effective national health system that can really put the right framework in place to deal with it. But yeah, I'm not aware of as many even local examples as I am aware of, that particularly within the US on that.
In the back.
You know, in the developing countries, there are very strong faith relationship between the faithful organization and the people. Have you tried to take advantage of that and build the infrastructure from that?
That's a good question. Personally, I'm not, in the cases we've been involved in, we haven't. It's not a dimension we looked at. But you're right, in terms of the emphasis that we need on education and raising awareness, that would be an avenue that we should be thinking about. I don't know if, Tamara, if you've ever heard of any projects that have looked at that. Well, I haven't.
No, I've never heard of that. I think the struggle has been so intense to try and get public-private, between government and industry, those partnerships off the ground. I think that that's actually a really innovative idea, and maybe one that companies and governments should engage in, particularly on that education side, because there is, with faith-based organizations, there is that trust also that is sometimes lacking both towards government and towards the private industry. So that it could be the third party that that really adds the trust component, that this work is something that is important and good for individuals. And ingestion of these things is actually something that's positive, and that's coming from a trustworthy source. So that's a good idea.
Yeah, it is.
We'll be passing that one along. Thank you.
I'd like to just follow that up really quickly along the same lines of trust. I liked your example of the bottle of soy sauce lifting weights there. But how do you get over any sort of fears or misunderstandings that might come from just the general public who see the ads and who are being marketed these products?
I mean, I think part of it is who your messenger is. I mean, it's there are a lot of competing claims and competing products out there in the market, and not all of them are accurate. And it's not just a question of, international producers are safer and local aren't. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's more in a very competitive situation. Not everyone is. Some people are cutting corners. Some people are making claims that are not always true, and consumers are aware of that and are probably cautious as a result. Which is why I think in the China case, it was only when the government campaign really kicked into gear and got to a high level that the company started to see results in terms of its improved sales of the fortified product. And within the first year, they were actually very hesitant and almost halted production and their participation in the program because they weren't seeing those results. But once they, particularly, in fact, partly through the GAIN grant that helped finance the scaling up of that social marketing campaign by the government agencies, that then started to see results in terms of the private sector sales. But it is a complicated issue, and there's a lot of distrust around foreign foods, around, particularly the idea of fears over genetically modified products. That gets tied in with products that have been fortified. People start assuming the same processes are involved. So it links into the whole education agenda. I don't know if you have any further comments, Tamara.
I do think that that's true, and I think that that's one of the issues that these companies have faced, actually, and one of the biggest hurdles to building a market is the distrust of these products and the distrust of the message around these products. I think as countries are being exposed more and more to marketing campaigns, and at very rural areas also, there is a growing distrust. And I think some of the companies that Michael has mentioned, some of the products that they've had that are related to micronutrient deficiency, but also related to other global health issues that are really, really important, they've had to pull from the market because they haven't been able to make it sustainable from their side to produce, which is really a shame. So again, it's not the technology, but it's the message, and it's the trust, and it's the understanding about why these things are important, and it's things that we in this country and in other developed countries just assume, and it's back of mind. When you buy a package of salt in the supermarket, you're not thinking, is this iodized salt? Of course it's iodized salt. We've all had it since we were born, and that's what it is. But when these things are introduced to new populations who have developed distrust generally for messaging, either from the private sector or from the government, for a variety of very good reasons, that becomes a huge, huge hurdle, and sometimes makes these projects unsustainable in the long term.
One related point to that is that it's not just consumer distrust. Often there's, many within the health community, be it international organizations like the bank or within ministries of health, there's a lot of distrust of working with the private sector, full stop.
Yeah.
This distrust of the profit motive, this distrust over the claims and verifying the standards and quality of the products. And there are some egregious examples in the past that, in some extent justified that attitude. But I think given the problems that are out there, we have to start fostering an attitude where, partnership has its benefits on both sides. And people, you'd be stupid to ignore the role the private sector can play. And I think those attitudes are changing, whether we talk to colleagues in development agencies of the UK or the US, or we talk to ministries on the ground. But it's taking time, and there are still those who are very resistant. And there are companies that are equally resistant on this. This is a government issue. We don't want to get too caught up in it and run the risk. So there's still, it's not just consumers who need to educate, but both sides as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, up here.
My question essentially would be, these products obviously reach those who can afford it, and therefore you're not reaching some people that really struggle to feed themselves day to day, and really can't buy a lot of these products. So what are the initiatives to reach the essentially poorest of the poor? And is this perhaps where NGOs come in, and linking with them and kind of having a tripartite kind of relationship rather than just private and public sector? And also, has there been any work with small-scale farmers to provide the inputs to this process, and kind of engage them on the process side as well?
I'll take the first part of that question, and I think Michael can speak to both of them. But the answer to both of them are yes and yes. That yes, the NGO community is heavily involved in this process, and depending on the country and locations, there are programs in place where NGOs and other organizations are distributing that food, sometimes at cost, sometimes through government grants like USAID or national government grants to the poorest of the poor. So it's not only a question of access. You have to go to your local supermarket, but supermarkets are only in urban areas and are only accessed by people in the middle class, or the poorest of the poor are getting these products, particularly children. A lot of these products are being distributed through school feeding programs in rural areas, and there is a lot of innovation actually, so it doesn't have to be rice, for instance. It can be an additive to a drink, or if a child has only 2 meals a day, you can add a little packet of micronutrients that taste quite nice. Apparently, I've never tasted them.
I have. They're
You
okay.
have? They're
Yeah,
good?
yeah.
I assume they must be. So you can add it to their cereal or to whatever the normal meal that is an unbalanced micronutritionally for them. But yeah, there is access to these goods for the poorest of the poor. The part of the point, though, is to make these products available widely enough so that these companies can continue to produce them in some profitable way, so it's sustainable for them. Because what has happened to a number of these initiatives is great technology, great distribution mechanisms, a losing proposition, and within companies they can't sell it as something that they can continue to do because they just can't make money enough to cover the production costs. So then it becomes kind of an orphan product that is in the knowledge bank of these companies but is not available to the public. So I think part of what GAIN is trying to do, and BAF in particular, is looking at business models that can make these products available to a wider array of people and through different venues. So it can be to the poorest of the poor through feeding programs, but it can also be to another sector of society that could offset the costs. And Michael, I think, can speak to the farmers, engagement of farmers, because that's also going on.
Yeah, I mean, the private sector part that GAIN is working on is one small portion of their overall program. A lot of it is working with local NGOs and with governments on distribution that is outside of a business model but is geared specifically to reaching the poorest. I still think that there is hope of reaching the poorest even through the business models. I mean, the soy sauce example, even those in very rural and remote communities were still getting a supply of soy sauce and purchasing it in very small amounts as they could afford it, but they've been able to prove that they are still reaching those who are at a very low income level.
If I can just jump in here for a second, if any of you have ever been in rural China or India and you've seen in the little shacks that people can buy products, tiny little packages of shampoo or one cigarette at a time, which is kind of the opposite of what we're talking about here. But there are products, the assumption that the poorest of the poor are not consumers, I think, is not quite true. But the products that need to be produced for them need to be of a certain size, a certain scale, and available in a certain way so that they can buy it through the means that they have. So if it's buying these things every day, like you can go out and buy an egg in rural areas of many countries, one egg. You don't buy a carton, you just buy one egg. Or you go out and you buy a demi little pack of shampoo or soap, very tiny pieces of soap. So there are products available to the poorest of the poor on a market basis. So it shouldn't be the assumption that because people are poor that they need handouts, and that this can't be a sustainable process, even if it concentrates solely on that population that needs it the most. So
Yeah.
sorry, Michael.
No.
Cut you off.
And on the production side, it's not as advanced as I think people would like it to be, but there are efforts to engage poor producers, not just consumers. The Tetra Pak example, which they switched production to cassava, they are sourcing from smallholder farmers who are producing cassava. And Tetra Pak, they're not involved in that part. They're just helping facilitate the purchase and then build a facility that has the right technical level to be able to produce that and create the fortified drink using it. But they are sourcing from local farmers. We work with there's a company in India called Britannia Industries that makes biscuits, and they're partnering with a local foundation on providing those biscuits for school feeding programs, which are fortified and can be drunk with milk or be part of the children's daily diet. But they're also selling those commercially, and it's actually quite a high penetration of something as even on biscuit scales that get down to quite a low level. I mean, that's not to escape the point. There are still a lot of people who everything they eat, they grow and produce, within their community. So the retail, for all the shifts in the in the food system where everything is increasingly centralized and going through retailers, there are still a large number of people out there who don't go to a supermarket. Everything is produced locally, which is why I think looking at models such as condiments through soy sauce, where that product might still be externally sourced, is one way to reach those. But we don't want to end that local production. That's one of the troubles here, is that we don't want to be seen to be promoting big business efforts here, taking over from local producers. But how do you find that balance where you can help still meet those health benefits whilst encouraging local entrepreneurship and business development, which is really what's going to take people out of poverty overall. Is that's what you want. You want local economic development, and then the rest will follow. But in the meantime, we still can't afford to neglect the health challenges.
And there are some companies that are more on the seed production side that have been talking about distributing seeds to small shareholder farmers or just families who have plots behind their house that they grow a variety of grains like rice or wheat, and that the seeds would be fortified, so the product would be fortified, and then you continue to farm on your family plot, but what you're farming is actually more nutritionally balanced. And I don't think that that's actually come to fruition yet for a number of reasons, but that was something that that's being discussed actively by some companies.
Any other questions? Yeah, one up here, Julie.
I wonder if enough time has gone by on the NutriSip program at this point to know anything about unintended positive outcomes or secondary outcomes. It seems like this has the potential to change a lot. And I wonder about that program or any other programs. Are there stories to tell yet?
They're starting to be. I mean, I mentioned corruption at the beginning, and one of the external benefits from the NutriSip program in Nigeria was that in all the struggles they encountered in trying to get the product imported from South Africa and reach the children on time, one of the delays was people demanding bribes to get it out of customs or facilitation payments, however you want to term it. And so, given the political will behind the project and the role of Tetra Pak and other companies in urging that they needed this, that started to highlight what those hold-ups are and why, and there was increased political pressure for those to be reduced, and also the amount of money that these schools were getting was well publicized in order to be able to purchase and use buy the products. And when their kids weren't getting the drink that day, the parents started to demand why, because they knew that the money had been given to the school. So definitely on that side we started to see benefits, and then it is starting to raise increased for Tetra Pak. I think it opened their eyes about the quality of the educational facilities that they were dealing with, the other social aspects they need to tackle, such as clean water. I don't think they've yet found ways through the project to address those, but at least they're starting to talk about it and raise it more with the government. And I think having access to the higher profile leaders is also important, because they're the ones who can make the phone call and make something happen, and that's really what you need. You need that ability to reach the person who can make the difference. But I'm hoping we'll see and document more of those, because part of the point of sharing these best practices amongst the companies themselves is so they can avoid repeating the same mistakes. We had a forum for all the Business Alliance members in New Delhi back in March, and one large part of the program was basically we set up a marketplace where each company had a stall saying what they're doing, and they would take it in turns by region, and they would all walk around and talk to each other and say, taste each other's products. And sometimes it can create problems. There was one company who was suspicious of where one of the others had found the technology to do something. So there are risks involved here too, but certainly in building that awareness and being able to talk about how they've built market share, how they've dealt with supply issues. It's addressing a bigger political and business environmental problems, not just those related to fortification.
Julie?
Quick questions. One is this year's development marketplace was based around health and nutrition. Are there any prospects coming out of that you are looking forward to or they're on the horizon? Also, most of the examples that you cited today happened post 2000. Do you have any longer term examples of successful projects?
Question. On the development marketplace, I'm not sure there were some innovative products and ideas that were showcased. I'm not sure what the follow-up has been. I know GAIN themselves were a part of that. And this is where the silos within the bank kick in, because whilst I'm working on a health issue, I'm working on it from the private sector development perspective. So it's always a battle to make sure we stay in touch with our health colleagues and actually learn what's going on and keep that interaction. So I will look into that. But in terms of you're right, most of these projects are certainly within the last 10 years, and many of them since 2000, with, I think, that reflecting this trend towards public-private partnership, increased attention to CSR, the launch of the Millennium Development Goals that helped galvanize attention around what business can be doing. I mean, some of these companies have been doing fortified projects, but they've been doing them in the US and Europe and in Australia and other developed country markets. And what wasn't happening was the transfer then to try and replicate those and extend them and adapt them to the local circumstances in developing countries.
I do think there were a few. There was I think it wasn't Nigeria. I can't remember. One of the flour fortification companies, a flour miller, has been fortifying for 15, 20 years, and recently became involved with public-private partnerships, but was doing all of the work already and was facing a lot of the barriers that I had mentioned, a lot of the political will, corruption, legal barriers, all kinds of things like that, and then now has been more engaged on the public-private partnership side, but there are outcomes of that project that company has been engaged in. And then there have been some other supplement I think the Supplifer Sprinkles has been going for 20 years or 15 years. A lot of these products have been in existence, they just have not been distributed in the ways that Michael and I have been talking about. These companies have not been engaged actively in the way that we've been talking about with governments and NGOs. They've been engaged in certain ways with NGOs and certain ways with governments, but not in this kind of partnership model. But there was also a salt iodization project in Latin America that's been going for a good number of years, that a company initiated, I think, in the 1970s. So there are a lot of projects that have been going on. I think the innovation now is working the three-wheel system, so not the two-wheel system like in the China example, but with all of the sectors working together to try and implement these products and get them to market and get them spread fast and quickly and widely. But yeah, there are results, and they're health results, the long-term longitudinal studies on fortification of foods in developing countries and their potential impact or the impacts that they've had on under fives or premature children or women, maternal and child health issues. So there have been a lot of studies and a lot of products.
It's just one final point. It's often a reflection where there's legislation in place.
Yeah.
And when a government mandates that something be fortified, the private sector reacts. What a lot of the examples we've been talking about are done on a voluntary basis where there isn't yet that legislation. And part of the advocacy role is to try and create demand for that. because that's where you ensure the maximum coverage, and you still have standards and quality issues, but you won the reason why they have to do it. They can't afford not to anymore. And it's building that. There are examples where, some of the poorest countries have put that in place and have been able to start having impacts. And South Africa has been moving to fortifying with new legislation, and we're pushing for that in other countries too. But I think that's where the more long-standing initiatives have often reflected where there's been a law in place that's requiring people to adapt and do that.
We have the main problem is micronutrients. However, have you, like for example, before you come into a country, have you have a think tank, going out and find out, okay, this is the most crucial problem in this country, and how to solve it? Looking at the government level, at the company level, at the people level, and involve the grassroots organization in that country in order to solve the problem from the bottom up and on around it. Have you ever do that kind of magnitude of problem? Because I see that each it seems like all developing countries have same problem, but I don't think one solution could solve all. And it seems like the tumble block is all, again and again. I think 10 years from ago and 10 years from now, we're still having the same problem. Had anybody who just try to pick one country and really know on a problem and have to solve it from top down and on around?
I think it's a very good point. I know of a few examples where the World Bank has been trying to galvanize that kind of action. In fact, there are some countries where GAIN, Ministry of Health, and private sector are working as what is called a National Fortification Alliance, Morocco being one of them, where they convened what they believed were the relevant stakeholders. They've been dialoguing about what the problem is and then how best to address it within that country's specific context. There are also a number of mapping initiatives. So the Gates Foundation has funded a number of studies trying to map out the extent of the problem, and both at national and regional levels. Micronutrient Initiative, another organization very active in this area, did a mapping of what African businesses are doing, sub-Saharan African businesses are doing around fortification, and what we can learn from that and then build on at each country level. But I take your point that there is still a need to, these aren't one-size-fits-all solutions. You do need to look at the country context, and you probably do need to go in and say, okay, who do we need to engage? What is the key problem, and how do we reach it? I think the Ministry of Health is often the first point of contact in that, but it doesn't mean it always gets to the place where it should.
Yeah. And to your point, Julie, these are early days in a lot of these initiatives, and I think as they progress, more groups will get involved. So particularly in the focus countries that GAIN is working on, I think the aim is, in the long term, to engage all of the sectors, and by all of the sectors that includes grassroots, so public, private, and NGO, from the bottom to the top. And to your point, there is a lot of study that goes on before an initiative is implemented to make sure that the micronutrients that are being distributed are the right ones for not only on the national level but on the regional level. But it is early days. I said 5 to 7 years of a project seems like a long time because we live in the digital age and things go really quickly, but in reality it's not that long, particularly in complex political and social environments. So I think the aim is, in the long term, to really engage from the bottom to the top. Yeah.
Have you seen any difference dealing with different type of government? For example, China or Vietnam is pretty much communism versus African government. Some of them are dictatorship, but there's some kind of like democratic government. So do you find any difference to work with them, and any particular proposal that affect one country more than the other based on their political dominance of the government?
To be honest, my colleagues who work in the health sector within the bank would probably know the answer better. I've only had engagement within the context of some of these specific initiatives, so it's hard to know. I suspect the answer is that it depends. What matters is you find someone who actually gets committed to addressing this problem, and that could probably happen in a government of any type, and building that political will to act. Now, there may be questions about some types of government are more than effective in the implementation and democratizing the process, but I'm not personally in a position to be able to have examined that and be able to tell you if there are differences or not. But I think the key is building the political will, no matter what the context. But there may be colleagues of mine who have more experience in working with governments on this who might know a typology, but I confess I don't.
I'm in the same boat.
Okay, well, I think we're out of questions, and thank you, everyone.